All right, praising and thanking God again for the way that he builds our understanding using various perspectives. Let's call Luke chapter 15, livestock part 3, in a chapter that uses three famous stories or parables that form what an older, wiser teacher used to describe as a triptych. Three individually independent stories that really come together to make a larger picture that can help us grow in wisdom and understanding and, God willing, just leading a better life. All that's preacher words. Let's just get into the chapter. Understanding that the first of these stories is going to fall in that pattern, as we mentioned, of livestock. Understanding that the first two verses are going to read this way. Now, the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him. And the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them," introducing his use once again of the way that they care for their livestock being a doorway through which he can understand how God cares for people. Something that they seem to have lost their ability to care for in the way that they should. But either way, he's going to then tell them the famous story of the lost sheep, the first story in the lost triptych. As my teacher then said, the second story in that lost triptych is the famous story, or not so famous story, of the lost coin, going from verses 8 through 10, leading into quite possibly the most famous part, or the famous lost story in the lost triptych, that being the story of the lost, otherwise known as the prodigal son. And I'm going to take a more conventional approach to teaching these chapters, since I was heavily influenced by one particular teacher who used to teach this as a triptych and basically say, these are three different perspectives on the way in which we can become lost as his people. Understanding that even though we can become his, that doesn't mean we can't stray. And that is what we see in the lost sheep, something that has constantly strayed from where it needed to be. However, the lost coin is an inanimate object that has fallen away from the position that it should have been in, whether it's in somebody's pocket, their sack where they're carrying their money, I guess, back in those days, or as I've heard it described before, there were certain ornaments that would have a full set of coins. And much like the lost sheep individually might not mean much, it's part of 100 or a full set that might have increased value if it is complete in number. So likewise, I've heard it taught that coin could have a place on a crown of 10 coins, and without that one coin, the whole thing loses the value that it would have if it was otherwise complete. And then finally, understanding the prodigal son is not just a sheep, it's not an inanimate object, or he's not an inanimate object. A coin, he's a live person who didn't just wander away. He's asking for his inheritance. He's rebelling. And so we're getting three different pictures of the way in which we can wander away, understanding that just life can get interesting. And sometimes it can seem more interesting than the things that God is calling us to do. Likewise, sometimes we can just fall away, understanding, much like he gave the parable of the four soils, there are things in life that can cause us to stumble, whether those be sins or other things that can cause us to not walk as straight or as confident or as well as we should. And then finally, we just get flat out rebellious. We can get tired of daddy's house and just want something different. And that is what we seem to see in that third part of the triptych, as we already mentioned, the story of the prodigal son. But in the story of the prodigal, we might see a representation of Christ's actual audience, which shouldn't be all that surprising, understanding that the way the story ends up shows us a father who does not force his son to even make it all the way home before he hears the son's contrition and runs out to meet him. But going back home, starting a party for the son who was lost and now is found, his other son's going to be real mad because he was working there the whole time. And he is not going to be any more rough with the son who was there the entire time than he was with the son to whom he showed compassion on his return. He is going to explain to the one who was wise enough to stay home why it's fitting to celebrate right now in a way that will allow him to increase his wisdom, not feeling slighted because his father might love the lost son more, but understanding in just how much danger his brother actually was. And so in the two sons, we may have a picture of the two portions of the crowd that Christ is ministering to. Those who were lost, straying, pretty much doing their own thing, who are finally beginning to pay attention and potentially listen to the things that Christ has said. And those who are angered by the attention that he is giving them because they've tried to serve God the entire time. Those who were wise enough to stay and serve God consistently, who he's now challenging to elevate their wisdom by caring for their lost brethren the way they care for their lost stuff.